Shalom, dear friends, and welcome to our Bible study on the book of Genesis. Well, today we're going to be in chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. And if any of you have looked ahead at this chapter, you may be kind of cringing about it because it is a chapter that is almost completely genealogies. The record of the various generations of the line of Seth up until Noah is, I believe, the last one that's listed there. These are very important Bible characters. But I must tell you that ordinarily, I don't like to spend a lot of time in genealogies. And I will tell you also that before I retired, I was a pastor for over 30 years. And frequently people would come to me and ask for my advice or counsel about, what's the best way to read the Bible? Should I start at Genesis or should I read the Gospel of John? Or, there's various approaches to it. And I have kind of a method of daily devotional Bible reading that I've been using for many years, and it serves me very well. But one of the bits of advice that I usually give to people when they say they're interested in, committing to a spiritual discipline of reading the Bible every day, I will tell them, when you come to the genealogies in the Old Testament, I encourage you just to skip over those and get to the more meaty stuff. That's true in the book of Genesis. There are quite a few genealogies there. But when you get into First and Second Chronicles, there are just chapter after chapter of genealogies. And for most people, it's just an ongoing list of Hebrew names that are completely unfamiliar, and some of them are very challenging to pronounce. And, when you spend any amount of time going through a genealogy, you just kind of wonder why I'm even doing this Bible reading thing. So I usually encourage people to skip over the genealogies. But we're not going to do that today for Genesis chapter 5. We are going to go through the genealogy. I don't think it should take that long. And then when we're finished with the text of Genesis chapter 5, I wanted to talk to you about some other topics, some other Bible topics that honestly are not some of my favorites, but I think you'll find that the material we talk about there is interesting and intriguing, will get you thinking. And the main reason that I'm going to spend any time on this today is I think when we come away from our study of Genesis chapter 5, you will be more and more convinced than you ever have been before that the Bible is an absolutely unique book, different from any other book that's ever been written, and it's got God's fingerprints all over it. And so, yeah, we'll talk about that when we get through with the text of Genesis chapter 5. But I do want to spend a few minutes on our introductory material here from my Genesis PowerPoint. So first of all, let's spend a little time reviewing the chart of the era of biblical history that we're in right now. It's called the Age of Conscience. I know I mentioned the last time that it's called the Age of Conscience because that was the main way that God chose in those days, from the days of Cain and Abel to the time of Noah and the flood of Noah's Ark. It was the main way he communicated with people. There are incidents in the book of Genesis where God would manifest his presence in a physical way, sometimes in human form, sometimes in different kinds of forms, and communicate with people in those kind of dramatic ways. But normally, the way God communicated with people then, and incidentally, he continues to communicate with them now, even after the Bible has been written, the main way is through conscience. I know everybody has experienced a guilty conscience, whether you're a Bible reader or whether you're a believer in God or not. Everybody's experienced a guilty conscience. And that is God speaking to you, telling you you're on the right track or you've done something wrong that you should be ashamed of. But the conscience is not only a negative thing, it's also a positive thing. As we read through these chapters of Genesis and study them, you're going to see that God is constantly conversing with people, but he's not doing it through the Bible. He's usually not doing it through supernatural manifestations of his presence, like when he spoke from Mount Sinai and when he spoke through the burning bush and things like that. Normally, he speaks to people through their conscience. So one of the things that we want to do as we focus on our devotional lives and our relationship with God is really be aware of how the conscience works and how God is really earnestly desiring to have constant conversations with us so that we can learn to not only speak to him in prayer, but also to hear his voice speaking to us through our conscience. And he'll provide us with all kinds of encouragement and guidance and counsel. He has great messages for us. He will enlighten us about things that we read in the Bible. And so conscience is really important, not only for this limited period of history in the book of Genesis, but also in our day and age, because God is still using the conscience. He has provided us with the Bible to serve as kind of a checks and balance, kind of an objective source of truth where we can kind of weigh these subjective conversations we have with God through our conscience. And one of the reasons that we would need to have that balance and weigh the things that we have kind of personally heard from God and spoken to him is because God is not the only one who can speak to you through your conscience. Satan can speak to you through your conscience. Demons can speak to you through your conscience. And some of them are pretty good at doing an imitation of God and making themselves sound like him and claiming to be him, but leading us down the road to destruction. So conscience is a really important subject in the Bible, and we won't focus that much on it per se, but we'll just see so much evidence of how God uses our conscience to speak to us and communicate with us. One more thing I will say about that is one of the arguments against the biblical faith, Christianity, or even Judaism, is what about people who have never read the Bible before? What about that guy who lives on a remote Pacific island and he's basically, he's off the grid. He's cut off from any kind of social media or any kind of communication with the outside world. Never read the Bible, never heard of Yeshua, never heard of Jesus. What about that guy? Is God gonna judge him because he hasn't read the Bible and because he's never heard of Jesus? And my response to that challenge would be, does that guy on that Pacific island have a conscience? And if he does, and he does, then God can communicate to him through that conscience and tell him all about Jesus or the Messiah or right and wrong and things like that. So if you've got a conscience, then you don't have any excuse when you stand before the judgment seat of our God. Just a few historical things. We've got the story of Cain here and Abel here, and we had the story of last time those two. Cain was a farmer and Abel was a shepherd, kept flocks and herds. And so those two got together for worship, and Cain brought, because he was a farmer, he brought what he had available to him as an offering to God, and it was vegetation. It was, I suppose the fruit of his harvested fields, and presented that to God, and it was not acceptable. But Abel's offer was acceptable because it involved the offering the fat portions of an animal that had been sacrificed and offered to God. And one of the biblical principles we learned from that, and the fact that God clothed Adam and Eve not in the fig leaves that had been their attempt to resolve their nakedness, symbol of their sinful situation, but he clothed them with animal skins, which required an animal sacrifice and the shedding of blood. So the Bible tells us that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. I think it's Leviticus 17:11 that says the blood is the atonement makes atonement for the soul of man. So as we continue our studies in the Old Testament, it's going to be increasingly made clear to us the significance of all the animal sacrifices that we see in the Bible. And of course, those are all symbolic of the Messiah who would eventually make the ultimate blood sacrifice and kind of render unnecessary the animal sacrifices, which were just types of the antitype. So Cain and Abel, Cain's sacrifice is not accepted. It makes him angry. He has kind of an argument with God. Cain and Abel are out in the field one day, and Cain decides to take out his frustration on his brother Abel and kills him. And I assume buries his body there. And God confronts him about it. Cain is driven from his homestead, from his own farm, his own property, and he becomes a wanderer in the east. And then we're also told that Adam and Eve had another child named Seth, who sort of takes the place of Abel. We talked about this red ribbon, or this red road of redemption that will run through most of these charts until we come to the cross of Christ. And the red, I suppose, is significant of the shed blood, which is so essential for the salvation of mankind. So I think it was in chapter 4, we had reference to some of the descendants of Cain, although they are not illustrated on the chart here, because they are not on the red road of redemption. But God chose Seth to be the ancestor of those who would be redeemed. And so here we have a list of some of the names that we will come across in the genealogy for today. So I believe that's about all we need to talk about at this point. I have some more things on the PowerPoint that I want to share with you, but we'll do that later. So let me go ahead and call up our Bible software here, and we will hit this genealogy and hit it hard, and I'll make a few comments as we go along. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. God created man, God made man. He created him as an absolutely unique creature that had never existed before, not in the prehistoric age and not in the days of creation before the sixth creation. So God makes him basically out of nothing, kind of speaks him into existence. But when it comes to forming his body, God uses the elements of the earth, the dirt of the earth to make him. And the Hebrew word for that dirt, that soil that God used, is Adamah, which is the feminine form of Adam. So Adam means man. Adamah means the soil from which Adam was made. So I usually like to point out that the names that God gave to his first human beings were, first of all, the woman that he made was named Chava. When that is translated into English, it's Eve, and Chava is the kind of the root word for life. And I think the Bible refers to her as the mother of all the living. So God names Eve life, and he names Adam something like dirt man. So that's kind of what Adam's name has reference to. But it's also kind of the generic word for human beings. So sometimes the Bible is going to be talking about the Adam, the guy by that name, and other times it's just going to be a reference to mankind. Verse 2 has reference to the two genders, male and female. He created them male and female. And, from this, we can conclude that there are two genders. Unless we're speaking grammatically, then there is a third gender, a neuter gender, which doesn't have anything to do with sexual reproduction. But even in biological terms, I guess you can crossbreed certain types of animals, and you can come up with a neuter type of a creature that cannot reproduce. And I think, as I recall, it's the mule. Like a mule is unable to reproduce because it's neuter because of the crossbreeding. But basically, we've got two genders, male and female. And in contemporary times, there's discussion of, not only the biological genders, but genders that you relate to, that you identify with, and such things. Certainly not biblical, and I think probably not helpful for society. So he created them male and female, and he blessed them, and he called them mankind. He called them a man in the day that they were created. So he created both of them in his image. And the reason that's important is there's a place in the New Testament where I believe it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10 or maybe 11. Paul is talking about male and female and their roles in relationship to each other in marriage and in society. And he makes the statement that the man, Adam, was created in the image of God. But I think the text says that Eve was the glory of man. It doesn't say she wasn't created in his image, but some people have come to the conclusion that because it specifically states that Adam was created in the image of God, that must mean Eve was not. But here, God created them, male and female, and he blessed them, and he called both of them man. So they're both created in his image and likeness. Let's look at the Hebrew for the first verse here and say, Elohim, let me see, Bara Elohim Adam Bidmut Elohim Asa Oto. So that's in the singular. So that doesn't help us to show that Eve was created in the image of God, but she was. Okay. Verse 3, and Adam lived 10 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Shet, or Seth in English. Now, of course, Adam and Eve have had two sons already that are named in the Bible, Cain and Abel, one of them still living, Cain, and the other one deceased as a result of his brothers murdering him. The Bible will also tell us that they had many many other children in their married life together. Some of them sons, some of them daughters. The question always I served in a church that had confirmation, which is kind of like a teenage Bible study program where people can learn about the Bible and stuff like that. And young kids, you don't hear many adults asking this question, probably because they ask the question in confirmation class. They'll say the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel and Seth, but they didn't have, but there are no girls mentioned. So where did the girls come from that they married? Well, God created one of them, doing a little operation on Adam. He brought Eve into the world, but all the other human beings came by, the principle of reproduction. So where did the girls come from? Well, Adam and Eve had a lot of them, and then future generations also had a lot of them. So, Some get real yucky about it and say, does that mean that Adam and Eve's children married their brothers and sisters? And the answer is obviously yes, they did. Nowadays, there is a stigma about that, over concerns about, too close, breeding too close in the family line because it can produce birth defects and things like that. So that has been illegal in most societies, marrying closer than, I don't know, a second or third cousin or something like that. But in these early days, that was not a problem. And of course, all the human beings ultimately came, male and female, came ultimately from Adam and Eve. And then later, after the flood of Noah, they came from Noah and Mrs. Noah. So after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. So that tells us if he lived 130 years and had Seth, and after he begot Seth, he lived 830 years, that tells us that he lived 930 years. So he didn't die physically on the day that he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He lived a good long time after that, but he did die spiritually. He was relationally separated from God because of his sins. And here's where it tells us that he and Eve, is implied, had sons and daughters. And if they lived that long and were reproducing through most or all of that period of time, just that couple would produce an awful lot of people. But then all of those people would be reproducing as well. And so the population would grow pretty significantly in these early years of biblical history. Verse 5. So all the days of Adam, that Adam lived, were 930 years, and he died. And this is a reference to his physical death, not his spiritual death, which had occurred much earlier. It's important for us to realize that because Adam and Eve sinned, all of their children that were born for many, many generations up until today were all conceived and born in sin, and were kind of under the curse of sin and needed to be redeemed. And so that's why most of the Bible is about the story of how God redeemed mankind through his son, Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach. So what we need to understand about Adam is that if Eve lived about the same period of time that Adam did, then they had about 930 years to believe what they needed to believe in order to access the redemption that God provided for them, ultimately through Yeshua, the Messiah. But in the days of the earthly lives of Adam and Eve, it was based on the promises that he made of redemption. And faith in those promises would be credited to people as righteousness. And in Genesis 3, we learn that immediately after they fell into sin, God made the promise of the seed of woman who would, come to defeat the enemy, Satan, who had tempted them and kind of ruined their spiritual lives and relationship with God, and that he would suffer and shed his blood in the process. So there in Genesis chapter 3, we have the first promise of redemption. And if Adam and Eve believed in that, then they would be considered righteous, and they would be redeemed and born again, and will be spending eternity with God. I don't think there's any way to know for sure if they ever did that, if they ever did, come, have faith in the promises of God of redemption. I would think there would be some indication of that in the scriptures, but if it's in there, I cannot find it. So all of us are in the same situation. We're conceived and born in sin, and we have whatever earthly life God gives us to believe in him and the redemption that he's provided through the shed blood of his son. And if we don't do that before the day we die physically, then our spiritual death or our separation from God becomes eternal death. But if we do believe in the promises of God and then the historical fact of the redemption through Jesus Christ, then we're born again, and we will spend eternity in fellowship and harmony with God. And of course, that's what we want, and it comes to us through faith in God's promises and His grace extended to us, considering us and declaring us to be righteous through our faith. So they say that if you're only born once, you're going to die twice. If you're born once, it means you're not born again, which means you didn't have faith in the promises of redemption. So you're born once, but you die twice. You die spiritually, and then ultimately you die eternally. But if you're born twice, that is, born on your birthday and then born again through faith in your Savior, then you only die once. You only die physically, but you'll live forever in fellowship with God. So Seth, after he was born, lived 105 years and begot Enosh. Now, this doesn't mean that he only lived 105 years. It means he lived 105 years after he was born, and that's when he begot Enosh. So this also doesn't mean that Enosh is the only child that Seth was the father of. He too probably had lots of, yes, he did, had lots of sons and daughters. But Enosh is the one who is chosen to show up in the genealogy because he's the one that has chosen to be chosen to be one of the ancestors along the red ribbon of redemption. So he, in fact, would be a distant relative. All of these people would be distant relatives of Yeshua, of Jesus. So after he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Now, before, lest I forget to do it, one of the things that people are puzzled about in this chapter is the length of years that these people lived. How could they possibly live that long? Well, back when we were in the videos on the subject of origins and the creation stories, the 6 days and so forth, one of the things that I suggested was that in these early days of Earth's ancient history, that the Earth may have been revolving much faster than it's revolving now. And we know from events that are told in the Bible that God is able to alter the angular velocity or the rotation speed of the Earth, because he did so on the long day of Joshua, and how the sundial stood still for like 24 hours. So God can stop the rotation of the Earth. He can speed it up. He can slow it down. And there's evidence that he did that. Also evidence of the fact that the Earth's orbit, we talked about that when we talked about the day 4 in the 6 days of creation. That the calendar changed in 701 because the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and also probably Mars, those orbits changed, and the day went from the year went from 360 days to 365 and a quarter. Whatever it is. So the Earth's rotation could change. And people's lives were calculated by counting the sunrises and sunsets. That's how you knew that a day had passed. So you'd count up the days and then translate that into years. So I'm saying that all of these biblical characters may have lived about the same length of time that we did, but if the Earth was rotating a lot faster, then they would have seen a lot more sunrises and sunsets than we do. Maybe, 6 to 10 times as many as we do. So the calculation of their age The numbers may be bigger, but their lifespans may not have been that great. And that theory that I just shared with you is also going to come into play when we talk about about Noah's Ark. And we talked about it in reference to the waters above the firmament or the atmosphere of the earth that aren't there anymore. And they probably disappeared at the time of the flood of Noah's Ark. So we'll talk about that when we come to it. So Enosh lived 90 years and he begot Canaan. Let me see how this is spelled. Canaan. After he begot Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years and he had sons and daughters. So see, all of them are having sons and daughters throughout their earthly lives. So the population is growing significantly. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years and he died. Canaan lived 70 years and he begot Mahalalel. After he begot Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Canaan were 910 years and he died. Mahalalel lived 65 years and he begot Yarad. There is no J in the Hebrew language, so if you see these names with a J, it's pronounced as a Y. In English, it just becomes a J. So Jesus couldn't pronounce his name with the J in Jesus. His Hebrew name was actually Yeshua, which starts with a Y sound, as does Jesus. So Yarad. And after he begot Yarad, Mahalalel lived 830 years, and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Yarad lived 162 years and begot Enoch. Enoch is an interesting character, as you'll see in the next few verses. So we're going to focus a little bit of attention on Enoch. Yeah, he's a standout. You can kind of see that a pattern is forming as we go through the genealogy. You know, the father lives a certain number of years and he has the son who is significant in the story of redemption. Then after that son is born, he lives a certain number of years until the day of his physical death, and then he died. And that's kind of the pattern that's used here. Well, Enoch is a little bit different. After he begot Enoch, Yarad lived 800 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Yarad were 962 years and he died. I think that's the longest life so far. Yarad lived a long time. Then we come to Enoch, his son, and Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. So Enoch's name is actually pronounced Chanok, like with a CH sound at the beginning. Don't really know why that came across in English as an E. It's Chanok. And he lived 65 years and he begot Methuselah or Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Henoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now it's a strange sentence. It's not as awkward in Hebrew as it is in English, but the fact that the word was is in italics means that the verb of being is not in the Hebrew, but it is implied. So Enoch walked with God. We were just told in the previous verse that Enoch walked with God like all the days of his earthly life. But then instead of dying, it doesn't say that he died. It says he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. And the Hebrew word for took him is lakach, which is the standard, usual, normal word for taking stuff. So very mysterious. Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. Now, whenever we come across something mysterious, one of the things that we want to do is do a little word study, like do a concordance search, or if you have Bible software, word searches are so easy to do in Bible software. But let us go to the book of Hebrews, where it also talks about Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 5 is what we're interested in to learn more about Henoch. It tells us that by faith, Henoch, which Hebrews is telling us that Enoch was a man of faith. Some people who lived in those days weren't. So the faith seems to be an indication that he believed the promises of God. He had a great relationship with God. And I was going to say when he died, he went to be with God, but that's not exactly the case here. So by faith, Henoch was taken away. And let's see, the word taken away here is, what is it? Let's see. Oh, I've still got Isaiah here. Oh, my text didn't change. So let me go to my resource guide here. Resource guide. This is going to be too complicated. Now, pull up a Greek New Testament here. Okay, let's forget about that. So by faith, Enoch was taken that he did not see taken away, so that he did not see death. I should be able to see what this word is in Greek. Metatithemi. So tithemi is like a verb of existence. Something is standing. And then meta means that it kind of transfers from one status to another. So basically, this taken away is the idea that in one instant, Henoch was standing on the earth. In the next, he was in the presence of God. So he did not see death. So the Bible is very explicit about why Genesis 5 doesn't say that he died, because he didn't. God took him alive into his own presence in the third heaven, apparently, the place where God lives. Such was not the case of other people who died, as we'll have to discuss in a later study. And he was not found because God had taken him. That's a direct quote from Genesis chapter 5. 5:24. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And what is meant by his pleasing God is that he believed the promises and his faith was credited to him as righteousness. So he got to be redeemed. He got to have eternal life, but he had a unique experience, kind of a unique reward, I guess, for his faithfulness, and that he was taken into God's presence without seeing death. And that is a very helpful explanation of what exactly happened to Enoch. But wouldn't you love to know more about that? Now, let me state here that on the horizon, this is kind of a spoiler alert, the flood of Noah's Ark is coming, and God is going to destroy all the human beings on the face of the earth, except Noah and Mrs. Noah, and then all of Noah's sons and their wives, and all of mankind other than that is going to die. And he takes groups of animals with him, so the animals after the flood can reproduce. So the flood represents God's judgment. But a typical pattern is that before God judges a place, whether it's the whole world or Sodom and Gomorrah or whatever it is, he evacuates the believers from the scene of judgment. For the Noah's Ark story, he had Noah and his sons build the ark, and that's how they survived the judgment of the flood. For Sodom and Gomorrah, God sent some angels to rescue Lot and his family. before the judgment fell. But there's also another way that he rescues people from judgment, and that is by, I'll just use the term rapturing them, like taking them out of the situation and into his presence. So I think Enoch would be a type, kind of a prototype of those who are raptured before a judgment happens. So, I will just be bold to say that Enoch was raptured. I don't think he was resurrected, though. I think he was taken up to the third heaven in his human body, and I think he still has it. I think he's still in his human body awaiting the resurrection, because that's going to come in it may come for Enoch in the book of Revelation. In chapter 11 in Revelation, there are two witnesses that are not named, and Enoch is a candidate. He may not be one of the two, but he's a candidate for it. The other candidates are Moses and Elijah. So, okay, there's the story of Enoch, and that's about all I can say about it, because I think that's about all there is to say about it. Then verse 25, Methuselah lived 187 years, and he begot Lamech. After he begot Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years, and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And I'm confident that Methuselah lived the longest life of any of these patriarchs. And he died. So his father did not die, was raptured, but Methuselah did die. And Lamech lived 182 years, and he had a son, and he called his name Noah. Now, one of the things I mentioned to you before is that there are similar names in the genealogies of Cain and the genealogies of Seth. Lamech, in Cain's genealogy, which was a chapter earlier, was not such a good guy. He was a very violent person, and acknowledged that he had committed murder. Here in Genesis 5, we've got a guy named Lamech, but he seems to be a good guy. He was Noah's dad, and he called his son's name Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us." And as we'll learn in a few minutes, Noah means comfort. That's the meaning of the word. So he named Noah because Noah would comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. So after the tree of the knowledge of good and evil incident, all generations of human beings really had to struggle and strive to be able to produce enough food to survive. Had to grow crops, raise cattle, work really hard, kind of fight the curse that God had placed on the earth. And after he begot Noah, Lamech lived 595 years, and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and died. You may notice that the longevity of each succeeding generation is getting a little less. So if the rotation of the earth was slowing down, it may not have slowed suddenly. It may have slowed gradually over a period of time. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're going to talk about the significance of the meaning of these names, but I'll give you this one a little early. Shem, Shem is the Hebrew word for name. So Shem's name means name. It can also mean fame or famous. Ham is a word describing heat, like if you have a fever, that's referred to as a ham. So it's the Hebrew word for hot. And then Yafet comes from the Hebrew word that means beautiful. So Noah had 3 sons, and their names were Hot, Famous, and Beautiful. Kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the genealogy, and we're here at chapter 6. We've only been at this a short time, but like I mentioned earlier, I do have some additional stuff that I want to share with you from my PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and get to that. I do want to share with you that, especially if we're reading the Old Testament, there is kind of a standardized um, approach to biblical interpretation. And in Hebrew, like I say, especially if we're talking about the Old Testament, there is a paradigm called pardes. Now, this Hebrew word that you see right here, that's the Hebrew word pardes. The consonants are Pe, Resh, Dalet, and Samek, or P, R, D, S. So here is the P, the R, the D, and the S. The vowels are written in here. They are written in vowel letters in the English. Interestingly enough, pardes is the kind of the root word of the Hebrew word that is often translated as paradise. Paradise is actually parades, is actually a Hebrew word, and it's where the English word paradise gets its meaning. And the English word is actually drawn from the Greek. So when the Greek refers to paradise, it's kind of the same as Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. So pardes, paradise, means an orchard or a garden. And these 4 consonants, PRDS, are a handy acronym for the 4 levels of biblical interpretation. So the first level is, it's called Peshat, which is a Hebrew word. It actually means naked. But what it means is like to look at a Bible verse and strip it of any other significance except like the literal or appropriate meaning of the words that are written there. So this is the first level of biblical interpretation, which is, to put it in English, common English, it would just be saying, the Peshat is what the Bible says. The next level is remez, which is a Hebrew word that means hint or suggestion. So there are things that the Bible says that more understanding or interpretations kind of expand on the simple meaning of what the text says. So it's obvious what the text says. You just read it, and whatever the statement of the biblical text is, that's what it says. But what does it mean? Like when we studied Genesis 1:1, we looked at the meaning of the word Elohim, and it's actually a plural word. But in Genesis 1:1, it has a singular verb. So we kind of drew the Trinity out of that. And appropriately so, because that is the meaning. So the Peshat is what the text says. The remez is what it means. Now, the way you get at the meaning is you look at other Bible verses that speak to that subject. You may look at the implications of the words themselves, the grammar of the sentence and things like that. The third level is drash. You may have heard the Hebrew word midrash, which is a school of study. Darash is like a deep dive into the text, trying to draw out, kind of the more subtle meanings of the text. I mean, you just study all the context, you do all the word studies, you study it as thoroughly as you can, and maybe you derive some deeper meaning beyond just the obvious textual meaning of the text. And then the fourth one is the sod, which is a Hebrew word that means secret or mystery. And the best example of this that I can think of is the Bible Code, which you may or may not be familiar with. Probably 20 or 30 years ago, there were a bunch of books written about the Bible codes, and I can't even remember the author's name. Authors' names, many books were written about that subject. And it was kind of like doing a word search with the Bible text. And we'll show you some examples of that. But these are very subjective and really kind of hard to dig out. Now, I want to give you my philosophy of how the Bible should be interpreted, because this is, I believe this is the specific calling that God has placed on my life. I think the training that he has provided for me and the passion in my heart is just to read the Bible text with you and maybe share some insights of meaning or even deeper dive meanings. But I will hardly ever go into the mysteries of the Bible, the things that are kind of hidden and you have to dig for, and maybe you find legitimate stuff and maybe you don't. This is a level of religious mysticism, and every religion has it. Eastern religions have it. Judaism has it. It's called Kabbalah, and various other related kind of branches of Kabbalah. Christianity has it. Mystical Christianity. Lots of things have been written about that. But I usually don't go into the mysteries. Because I believe that the Bible was a book that God wrote in plain, clear language so that people can understand what he wanted to say to them. And if that was God's goal in causing the Bible to be written, it's beyond me why he would want to hide things there, particularly essential things. That would be kind of a mean trick on people. If your salvation depends on something that's hidden in the text and you try but you can't find it, that would be mean of God to judge you for that. But that doesn't mean that I don't think the hidden things are there. I do believe they are there. And I'll give you some examples of that as we continue on. But I just wanted to let you know that there are this is kind of a universally accepted paradigm of biblical interpretation. The one I'm the most interested in is the Peshat. I just want to be able to tell you what the Bible verse says. And part of my training is in the original languages in which it was written. So, I can tell you maybe a little more about what the text says than people who haven't studied the languages. The remez, or the hints, the meaning of those things that the text says, that's kind of theology. It kind of hints at hints. Very good. It hints at theology, systematic theology. Drash is just deep dive meanings. You want to know, everything you can about the text. So you just study everything you can find that relates to it. And then you got the mysteries and stuff. I'm all about this first level, the Peshat. I'm very interested in, but not as enthusiastic about the Remez. I enjoy the drashes that usually I can't figure those out on my own. I have to get those from other teachers. And I find those interesting and fascinating, and it makes me feel really smart. But I hardly ever make any reference to the Sod at all. But today we're going to be talking about the Sod in the Bible, the Bible codes, if you will. Now, the first exposure I had to the Bible codes, or the Sod level, the fourth level of interpretation, was when I went to seminary, and I think in probably the most boring class, which was called Principles of Biblical Interpretation. I was told, in just kind of in passing, that there is this thing called equidistant letter sequences. And the example that I was given in that class is the one that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes. And so the professor and the seminary that I attended was not a mystical seminary at all. It was, very orthodox, kind of in the extreme. So it so the Bible codes were not something that was intriguing to any of my professors, and they didn't want to make it intriguing to their students because they didn't want their students wasting time on something that wasn't significant and related to ministry and so forth. But the professor told me about the equidistant letter sequences, and what he said was, one example of it, and there are tons of examples of it, but the example he gave me is that if you go to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, which is what we have on the screen here, in the Hebrew text, it has to be in the Hebrew text, and you go to the first yod in Genesis 1:1, and my cursor is pointing at it here. That is a yod. And you start counting there, and you count letters. You don't count the vowels, because the vowels probably were not in the original Hebrew text. You just count the consonants. So you count all the consonants, and when you count out 50 letters, the 50th letter is a hey. And I've got the yod highlighted in yellow, and I've got the hey, or H sound. The yod is the Y sound. The hey is the H sound. Then you count out 50 more letters, and you come to a vav. My highlighter got away from me a little bit, so it's the letter on the right, the longer one. That is a vav, or a V sound. And then you count out 50 more letters, and you come to another hey, or H sound. And if you keep counting, then you come to another yod, hey, vav, hey. And if you keep counting from there, apparently, and this counting that I did here for this screen is about as far as I want to count. But I'm told that if you keep counting, you can count through the whole Bible, and every 50th letter will spell out Yud Hey Vav Hey. Well, what is Yud Hey Vav Hey? That's the sacred name of God. That is Yahweh. That's how you spell Yahweh. So that is fascinating. That is fascinating, and I'll tell you why I think it's fascinating. But before I do, I've got to pose the question that occurs to me, and that is, so what? That's very interesting, but what does that do for me? I mean, if I want to see Yahweh's name, I just go to where it's spelled out, one letter after the other in the word of the name Yahweh, and there it is. So I don't really learn anything from this, but what I do learn is that apparently equidistant letter sequences, like I say, they are just found all over the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And it seems to be like one layer of a template that God lays over the Bible to show that these letters and these words weren't just picked randomly, but the words and the letters that God inspired the men who wrote the Bible to write had these characteristics, that every 50th letter spelled out Yahweh. And there are other examples of it with other words that are spelled out. But what this tells me is that this is one layer of a lattice work. Then we'll talk about another layer that you'd have to lay on top of that, which is called the heptadic structure, that we'll talk about in a few minutes, so that these letters and words that God chose to have written in the Bible had to fit into not only the equidistant letter sequence template, but also the heptadic structure that was laid on top of it. And there are other structures as well. Heptadic is a reference to the significance of 7 in the kind of arrangement of the words and letters. And we'll talk about that in detail. But there are layer upon layer of those. But let's say that I challenged you to write a book as good as the Bible, and you said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll do that over the weekend. But then I said, when you write it, every 50th letter that you write has to spell out Yahweh. And like the words and the letters that you choose have to be multiples of the number 7. Well, your job has just gotten, almost impossible for a human being to do. So you might say, well, I'll go to my computer and I'll let my computer do those calculations. And then, I'll see what I come up with. But there are not 2 layers. I mean, there are layer upon layer upon layer. And I don't know how many layers there are. But all these templates were like the demands of the templates were satisfied by the text that was produced. And what that tells me is there is no human being, even with a supercomputer, that could produce a text like we have in the Bible that could fit all of the templates that were demanded of it. So that tells me that this text must have been written by God, because a human being couldn't do it. Moses couldn't do it. Apostle Paul couldn't do it. None of them could do it if they had to do it on their own. So the only way that this text could be produced through all those templates is that God inspired the writing down of every letter and every word in this text. As Jesus would put it, every jot and tittle. Every jot is the yod, the smallest letter, and the tittle are the little distinguishing tags, you'd call it, that distinguish one Hebrew letter from another. So Jesus says every jot and tittle. Not just the ideas are inspired, but the words and the letters and the parts of letters were all inspired by God. So that's one example of the Bible codes. One book I have in my library, and I don't have any of the other Bible codes books. I've seen them, I've read some of them, but I don't have them in my library. I do have this one. It's called The Cosmic Codes by Dr. Chuck Missler, who was associated with Calvary Chapel. Great, insightful Bible teacher. His videos and his books are still out there, and I highly recommended them. But the Cosmic Codes is about hidden messages from the edge of eternity, hidden messages that only God could write. And he probably figured you guys will never find them, but they're in there. So, yeah. And then what we have here is kind of an introduction to these hidden cosmic codes, the mystery of Methuselah that we studied about in the genealogy. And that is the part of his book that I kind of want to get to. So in the genealogy that we studied today in Genesis chapter 5, I think there were 10 generations mentioned there. So there are 10 names. And one of the things that Chuck Missler has discovered about this is he's really studied the Hebrew meanings of those names. Now, we've already talked about one of them, and that's the name Adam, or Adam in Hebrew. And we've already determined that it means man. Now, a form of that word also means, the dirt, the soil from the earth. It can mean mankind. It can mean male and female. But the basic root meaning of Adam is man. The second name in the genealogy was Shet, the son of Adam and Eve, and his name means appointed. Appointed. And again, with the word Shet, it has other variations of meaning, but the basic meaning is appointed. Seth's son was Enosh, and that is the Hebrew word for mortal. And it can also mean frail, miserable, grief, woe, sickness, and wickedness and stuff like that. But the main meaning is mortal. Now, you may wonder why I'm going into the meanings of these words, but I'll show you in a few minutes. Kenan means sorrow. Whoops. Mahalalel. Mahalalel means the blessed God. So in the name, the El on the end is a shortened form of Elohim, which we know means God. And then in the root, we've got Hallel, from which we get the English word hallelujah, which means praise. Hallelujah means praise Yahweh. So Mahalalel literally means the blessed God. Then we had Yarad, and that means shall come down. Now, this is the same root word as the Jordan River. And the reason the Jordan River or the Yarden River is called the Yarden is it means that it comes down. So the Jordan River starts up on the heights of Mount Hermon in kind of Golan Heights area. Mount Hermon is probably the biggest mountain in the area. And there's a spring or something up there that produces water, and it runs down the mountain through the Jordan River Valley down into Lake Hula, which is a small lake just above the Sea of Galilee. Runs into the Sea of Galilee. I don't know what the elevation of Mount Hermon is, but it's very high. And then by the time it hits the Sea of Galilee, it is 700 feet below sea level. Now, you don't think of the Sea of Galilee as being below sea level, but it is 700 feet below sea level. But it flows out the southern end of the Sea of Galilee and runs downhill to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on the face of the earth, and that is 1,200 feet below sea level. So Yorad, like the Jordan River, means shall come down. The next name, Chanok, means teaching or commencement, like the start of something. But again, the basic root word is teaching. Then we come to Methushalach, which is kind of a compound word. This actually means met is the Hebrew word for death, and shalach means to send. So his name literally means when he dies, it will be sent, or it will be sent and then he will die. This is probably a reference to the flood of Noah's Ark. Methuselah probably died in the great flood. So his name, Methushalach, means the year that Methuselah died, the flood came. Lamech comes next, and his name means despairing, and other things like a lamentation and maybe some other things as well. And then the 10th name is Noach, which we've already said means to bring a relief or comfort. Now, again, why would I share that with you? Well, there may be a hidden meaning here. So if we take those names on the next page here and we just list them out, Adam, Shet, Enoch, Canaan, and so on, and then we give the meaning of them in English and read down through what this says, it says, man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring the despairing rest or comfort. Now, as I'm reading this to you, I'm getting goosebumps, little shivers. That's extraordinary. That these 10 names, and who named the kids what they named them? The people did. God didn't name these people. He may have suggested their names. He may have commanded their names. But this may be a hidden message. And what's the message? This is the gospel presentation. Man appointed mortal sorrow. Why? Because he's a sinner and he's separated from God by his sins. But the blessed God shall come down. So which person of the Trinity came down teaching and died to bring the despairing rest and comfort? It's the story of Jesus in those 10 names. That's an example of a sod. So we've seen the equidistant letter sequences. This may be an example of a sod. It may be kind of contrived because each of these names has a kind of a variety of interpretations and meanings. But there you go. That may be an example of a sod. I'm not going to teach it other than just sharing it with you. But again, when I see that, like, why does it give me goosebumps? Why does it give me shivers? Because it's telling me that there is an intelligent design, not only to the creation, but to this book, to a chapter on genealogies that hardly anybody's interested in except the people who that was their family. But I think this is another evidence of God's fingerprints being on the inspiration and transmission of the Bible. Well, I talked about the heptadic structure before, which means that there is a significance of the number 7 throughout the Bible. So down at the bottom of the page here, the example that Chuck Missler gives is the first verse of the Bible, which we're familiar with. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In Hebrew, Barashit bara Elohim et hashmaim ve'et haaretz. So if we use that as an example and search out the sevenfold structure of that, we discover that the number of the Hebrew words is 7. Now, how many words are there in English? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it doesn't work in English. But in Hebrew, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 words. Okay, number 7, just a coincidence. The number of letters are 28. There are 28 letters in here. And again, you don't count the vowels, you only count the consonants. But there are 28 Hebrew letters, which is a sum or a total of 4 times 7 letter. The first 3 words contain 14 letters, which is 2 times 7. The last 4 Hebrew words, 14 letters, which is 2 times 7. The 4th and 5th words have 7 letters. The 6th and 7th words have 7 letters. 3 key words, God, heaven, and earth, have 14 letters, 2 times 7. The remaining 4 words have 14 letters, 2 times 7. And you may say, well, that is the biggest waste of time I've ever heard. And I agree with you, it is. But this isn't the only verse that has that kind of sevenfold lattice work that is a template that makes a demand on the text of Scripture and is satisfied in the inspired document that we have. One other thing I meant to share with you when we were studying day 4 about the day when God caused the sun, moon, and the stars to do the thing that he wanted them to do, to set them in their orbits. And I wanted to talk a little bit about astronomy, which is a legitimate science, and also astronomy, which is not a legitimate science, which is kind of pagan mysticism, and which the Bible forbids. But I mean, people did study the stars, and that was how they, established calendars and things like that. Astronomy acknowledges that there are arrangements of constellations of stars in the sky. And if you observe them, they seem to have a certain kinds of traits. And as you go from culture to culture around the world, there's a similarity in all these traits of the various arrangements of the stars. So I think there are 12 of them. They're pretty well known by the names here. Chuck Missler writes about this also, I think in that book, Cosmic Codes. But he indicates that the names by which the constellations are known now are Latin names, like Virgo is the Latin word for virgin. But the real significance of the constellations that gives the meaning of the constellations is found in the original Hebrew word that was used in the constellations. So to do that, you got to study a little Hebrew, which makes it more challenging. But I'm just going to go quickly through these, and I'm going to talk about the name of the constellation and what is depicted there. So the first one, the deacons, and I forget what deacons mean. It's kind of a scientific name or a grammatical thing, of Virgo or the Virgin. Its references the infant, the branch. The Bible talks about Jesus as the branch and the desired one. This all comes from a book by a Lutheran scholar, actually, named Joseph Seiss, called The Gospel in the Stars. Joseph Seiss was a great Bible scholar. The next one, this is still has reference to Virgo. The great shepherd is depicted there, walking forth before his flocks. Libra is the name of another constellation. It's called the Southern Cross. Get it? Cross. It has reference to being slain, pierced to death, the crown, which the serpent aims to take, called the northern crown. Remember, Jesus was crowned with the crown of thorns. Then Scorpio has to do with wrestling with the serpent, the heel of Scorpio, crushing it with the other. Wounded in his heel, just like in Genesis 3:15, the other foot over the dragon's head. Remember, the serpent in the Garden of Eden was Satan. In Revelation, we're told in Revelation 12 or 13, that the serpent that was in the Garden of Eden was Satan, the devil, and he's also called a dragon there. Sagittarius has to do with Draco, or the dragon, the old serpent, winding himself around the pole in horrid links and contortions, kind of reminiscent of Numbers 21, the story of the snakes biting the Israelites during the Exodus, and God commanding Moses to make a statue of a snake on a pole, kind of like the medical caduceus, I think is the name of it. Capricornus, or Capricorn, a killing dart sent forth, the naked shaft of death, and then springing up, rising out of the sea. So Jesus is put to death with nails through his hands, but then he rises again. Aquarius has to do with a fish. Most people are familiar with the fish symbol as the ancient symbol of Christianity. And in fact, that symbol may have been drawn from this. Also, a white horse is depicted, winged and speeding, as with good things, like when Jesus comes in power and great glory. Going and returning, he came to earth, returned to heaven, coming back again, bearing the sign of the cross. Pisces is the fish, the band holding up fishes, held by the Lamb. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In Pisces, we also have a crowned king. Let me move my picture here so I can read this. Holding a band and scepter with his foot as a great victor and Lord. Andromeda, a woman in chains, threatened by the serpents of Medusa's head, which sounds like Genesis chapter 12 and the man-child. Aries, we have the woman enthroned, the sea monster closely, strongly bound by the Lamb. Revelation 20 right there. Armed and mighty man with winged feet, who is carrying away in triumph with cut off head of the monster, full of writhing serpents and holding so it sounds like a great battle between the Son of God and Satan and his demonic legions. Taurus, the bull, a glorious prince with a sword girded on his side and his foot on the head of the hare, or the serpent. The shepherd carrying the she-goat and two little goats, like the good shepherd who goes after the lost ones. Gemini, the prince coming. Cancer, the greater shepherd, or the great shepherd. The guardian and keeper of the flock, Psalm 23. Leo, I forgot to highlight the name there. The fleeing serpent trodden underfoot by the crab, and the lion. Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah. The cup, or the bowl of wrath, like the bowls of judgment in Revelation, and the serpent, the tearing of the serpent. So it may very well be that, all the terms that we've described here sound like a biblical description of Jesus. So it may be that the stars actually do kind of paint a picture of the redemption story through Yeshua, the Messiah. So, once again, before we end, I hope you have found the sods, the Bible codes that we've talked about, the hidden stuff that definitely is in the Bible. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope it has increased your faith and confidence in the Bible, that it is actually a document that's inspired by God. In the New Testament, the word for inspiration is theopneustos, which means God breathed. So the Bible really is a love letter to you. It gives you the information that you need to be redeemed from sin and to be a child of God, to be born again, to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and to live with him forever. And I think probably that's the last time you'll hear me talking about the Bible codes or the sod level, that I really, I'm not comfortable treading there, because I'm really not smart enough to find these things myself. And if I do find something, I wouldn't know whether it was legitimate or not. But I think enough people have devoted their lives to discovering these things that I am convinced by their discoveries that these things are there, and that when God caused the Bible to be written, it was an extraordinary thing, that had to conform to all these different layers of templates, and the Bible fits the bill. And I dare say no human book could ever fit that bill. So, since we've been talking about the Old Testament, let me give you a blessing from the Old Testament. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. So I hope to see you next time for Genesis chapter 6. If you thought the stuff that we studied in Genesis chapter 5 was really weird and bizarre, then maybe Genesis 6 will be even more so, but we won't have to go to the depths of the sod or the hidden mystical stuff. We'll go to the historical stuff, and sometimes, history's truth is stranger than fiction. So we'll talk about that next time. Peace be with you.